We don't know. The guess is good that it was made in the Middle Ages, medieval times, say 1000 AD plus or minus 200 years, and probably it was developed in Europe. Who invented it? We don't know. Whether it was made by one person or a group of people working across generations is unclear and lost to history. However, we can follow their thought processes, the thinking they used to invent this tool. And we can do that by seeing what they came up with, what they basically created. Now, at one end, what you'll see is an iron spindle. Okay, we've seen the spindle before, right? It was derived from the drop spindle. And I find it very elegant to see how new inventions are based on previous inventions and how they are adopted and adapted. What they did was they took the vertical drop spindle and they turned it 90 degrees to make it horizontal. They attached it to a wooden platform, and they did away with the wooden whorl, the flywheel, whose weight keeps the spindle spinning around. They could do away with the whorl because of the primary invention of the spinning wheel, which was the addition of the wheel. So we have the spindle at one end, we have the wheel at the other, and they are connected by a drive band. Now on this wheel, there is a hand crank that I use to keep the wheel moving. As the wheel turns, the drive band goes down to the horizontal spindle and turns it. Now the technique for spinning on this wheel is exactly like the hand spindle, the off the point or from the tip spinning that we mentioned earlier. It's the same thing that is used on a walking wheel when you're spinning wool or other fibers. What we do is we take the thread, it's going to roll off the tip of the spindle. And as it rolls off the tip, the twisting of the thread will run up into the fibers, turn them into new thread, and then we will be able to make as much thread as we can stretch out the length of our arm. As with the spindle, there is a specific limit to how much thread we can produce at any one time before we have to stop spinning and wrap that thread around the spindle. That limit is determined simply by the length of our arm. So on this wheel, we are still spinning and then wrapping, spinning and then wrapping. But what I think you'll notice is that with the wheel as opposed to the spindle, we can actually do the wrapping much faster. Now, in addition to the wheel itself, we need to have a distaff. And the distaff for this type of wheel is different than what we've been using. This is a freestanding or standalone distaff. It's actually a marriage piece. We combined a base from a yarn winder with what is actually a wooden flagpole staff that came from some fraternal organization. I don't remember if it was the Moose or the Elks or the Masons or whatever. But I couldn't find a real standalone distaff, and so I made one. This is also called a hanging distaff because the flax will hang from the top of the distaff or near the top of the distaff. Will simply hang directly down. It won't be wrapped. It will simply drape down around the shaft of the distaff, and we'll be actually pulling the fibers from the bottom of the distaff mass. Now we're going to dress this hanging distaff. We're going to take these beautiful lawn flax fibers and we're going to beat them out so that the ends are not tangled. And then we're going to lay them on the floor and we're going to spread them out a little bit. And then you take the entire distaff and you lay it down on top of the fibers. And then you wrap the fibers around the top of the distaff and you take twine, thread, ribbon, or in this case, linen tape. And you're simply going to tie the fibers to the top of the distaff. I'm going to use a nice little bow knot here. Then, when you raise the distaff up, the lead came out. Let's put that back in. There we go. When you raise the distaff up, the flax fiber is hanging down, hence its name, the hanging distaff. And we're ready to start spinning. Now, when we start with this type of wheel, I like to pull out enough thread so I can get pretty close to the fibers. And then we're going to pull down some fibers, again, using our spit to start the thread up. Now, as we start the wheel, the twist starts coming off the point and runs up into the fibers. And then we will pull down fibers off the wheel, off the distaff. And we'll make the thread as long as we can pull back our hand. That extension is important because it gives us critical inches of fiber for our thread. Now, once our arm is extended, then it's time to wrap the thread around the distaff. So, then we use the wheel for that. We simply roll it right onto the distaff. We keep out enough thread so that we can continue on. Now, usually, we shouldn't have to stop like this to add more. I actually wrap too much thread onto the spindle. Now let's see how we're going to do this time. You can see how the twist runs into the fibers. Again, you can make a very tight thread with this type of spinning thread that does not have to be spun more than once. As you reach the full extension of your arm, then you stop spinning and then wrap it around the spindle, leaving enough thread so you can keep moving without stopping. You can see how you can get a very smooth motion of spinning with this type of wheel. You can pull out enough fiber so you can reach the end of your arm, start the wheel up, and then roll it right around the spindle. I find the advantage of this type of wheel over the hand spindle is in the fact that it's so much faster to wrap the thread around the spindle. This particular wheel is not a medieval wheel. The base and the spinning wheel itself are a bobbin winder. The wooden or the steel spindle is from a wool walking wheel, and I added a crank to it. The reason I made this wheel, however, is because I was tired of disappointing decades of young children who would rush to my single flyer wheel and asked where Sleeping Beauty pricked her finger. Well, Sleeping Beauty was actually a medieval character. She was not a colonial lass. She did not use a single flyer wheel. And I had to disappoint the kids and say, well, this was not the wheel. And rather than do that anymore, I decided it was time to make a wheel, a type of Sleeping Beauty wheel. And so now when they come and say, well, where did Sleeping Beauty prick her finger? I can say, here. She pricked her finger right here on this sharp point. And that leaves them happy. The earliest versions of the Sleeping Beauty tale actually had her using not a spinning wheel, but a drop spindle or a hand spindle. With this drop spindle, there is a sharp point at the end of the metal shaft, and you can see how easily it would be to prick your finger if you were handling it and accidentally just would stick yourself. I've had personal experience with this during summer folk festivals and historic sites. I'm in my colonial clothing. Typically I'm barefooted, and if I'm walking around through the crowds demonstrating the drop spindle process, I'm using my bare foot to actually keep the spindle going as it gets closer to the ground. Inevitably, however, the thread will sometimes break, and then the spindle will just drop to the ground. I have to do a little quick two-step to move out of the way so I don't get a stigmata in my foot from being jabbed by the spindle. So this is the type of thing on which Sleeping Beauty could easily have stabbed herself. This 19th century print shows a medieval version of the Sleeping Beauty tale. The crone, or the witch, is sitting in her massively ornate chair, looking down at the young girl who is obviously not yet sleeping. The familiar of the crone, the cat, is also in the picture, and Sleeping Beauty is using a drop spindle. We're probably coming very close to the point in the story where she will be stabbing herself, her finger, pricking it with the spindle, and then falling asleep for such a long period of time.